Hello and welcome to Sense and Sustainability. This is your podcast series for everything to do with sustainable supply chain management. I'm Sean McCarthy, a Director of Action Sustainability, and I'm going to talk today very briefly about definitions. What is sustainable procurement and how do we define it? I'd like to start by saying I hope this is the first and last podcast you ever listen to about defining sustainable procurement, because quite frankly, it's a bit boring and it's a waste of time. For the last 15, 20 years, I've sat in endless meetings, intellectually debating how we define this thing. And all the time we're doing that, we're not actually doing it. We're sitting around and thinking about it. So let me talk to you a little bit about the history of definitions of sustainable procurement. I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology, and then hopefully we're done, and hopefully you'll never have to think about this again. I was involved in the UK government Sustainable Procurement Task Force back in 2005. I think this was the first organisation of its kind where government wanted to get some advice from industry about how they can leverage more sustainability through their procurement activities. And it was a great group of people. It was chaired by Sir Neville Sims, who led the organisation and led the effort really well. And they came up with a report in 2006 called Procuring the Future. But they set off a subgroup to go away and try and come up with a definition for sustainable procurement. And this is what they came up with. This is not a joke, this is real, it's still in the report, you can still find it. Sustainable procurement is a process whereby organisations meet their needs for goods, services, works and utilities in a way that achieves value for money on a whole life basis in terms of generating benefits not only to the organisation, but also to society and the economy, whilst minimising damage to the environment. That trips off the tongue, doesn't it? That inspires you, that's easy to remember. Interestingly, in his foreword to the report, Sir Neville Sims came up with this expression that I really like. Sustainable procurement. In other words, using procurement to support wider social, economic and environmental objectives in ways that offer real long-term benefits. I like that definition. It's short, it's inspirational, and it gets everything in. But the official definition in the paper was the very long one. Since 2006, lots has happened. We developed a sustainable procurement standard, BS 8903, the first of its kind, was developed in the UK and published in 2010. That used the same definition as the definition that the task force came up with. But then things moved on, and we had a steering committee to develop the ISO 2400 standard, as it became, which was published in 2017. Once again, we had a very long debate, this time from people from different countries and different cultures, about what we should call it. We came up with this definition: procurement that has the most positive environmental, social and economic impacts possible over the entire life cycle. If I'm perfectly honest, I like that definition less than the one that Neville Sims came up with, but it does get it all in. And we discussed a lot the terminology that we use here. So for instance, we talk about procurement. Now, procurement for me is all of the activities necessary to deliver a business outcome through a supply chain. It's not just the buying bit, it's not just selecting the most sustainable supplier. It's everything from definition of need through to actual fulfillment of a contract or delivery of goods. Very important that we understand that, and also disposal of goods. The standard also talks about over the entire life cycle. The life of a product or a service is very important, not just thinking about the initial purchase. And using environmental, social, economic impacts is very important, but we use the term positive, not the term negative. I think we're moving away now from talking about minimizing damage to the environment or reducing risk of things like unethical practices. We're talking about positive impacts. We're talking about making a positive difference. So I do actually quite like that definition. I think it works well, it's quite short, and it gets everything in. So moving on a little bit then to talk about terminology. I hear all sorts of terms being used: sustainable, green, CSR, corporate social responsibility, that is. The latest one, ESG, environmental and social governance. This is something that's used by the financial services sector. Because the financial services industry is getting much more interested in this, everybody now is talking about ESG. I hear different terms for the term that I would use: sustainable procurement. I hear green public procurement. I hear responsible sourcing. I hear ethical procurement. Interestingly, CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, used the term sustainable and ethical. They obviously couldn't make up their mind which term to use, so they used both. Do you know what? It really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you call it. I work with clients all over the world, and I would recommend, because the standard says sustainable procurement, that's the term you should use. But if in their culture responsible procurement feels better because it would resonate more with their employees and their stakeholders, then say responsible procurement. If responsible sourcing is a better term to use, that's one that I hear quite a lot, then use that term. But don't be confused. Don't think these are different things. They're not. So don't worry too much about what you call it. Let's just get on with it. That wraps it up for me on this podcast series. Thank you very much for listening to me. Sense and Sustainability, your podcast for sustainable supply chain management.